All right, got her cleaned up a little bit, and that was really dark black. Really doubt that was from barn chain oil unless they were running regular oil in their oil tank. Also, with how dark black and the carbon buildup in here, there was clearly leaks taking place. Could have been around the seals. With as dark as it was, there could have been oil bypassing. Could have been another air leak elsewhere. Anyway, it's pretty clear that there was too much stuff got into the crankcase, and that eventually had some consequences on the crank bearings. It's still possible that the crankshaft might be salvageable. So what I've done here is put on a oil seal puller. It's actually from different model Husqvarna saws. But I think this might be about the right size to work on this. And you start by screwing this. You got to have the right diameter threads that it meets up against the edge of the metal and rubber part interface of the seal. And then after you've gotten that started and hopefully can get it into the seal far enough, then you tighten this down against the crankshaft and it'll just start pulling that seal out. You do have to be careful if you don't use a tool designed for this kind of thing, because what will happen is there is a chance if you pry those seals out that you could score the edge of the crankcase. And if that happens, you're just opening yourself up to all kinds of air leak issues, which may not be resolvable. And with something as simple as that, you could literally ruin the crankcase. So I don't know if I have this screwed into the seals enough. We'll find out. If not, I may have to use a screwdriver to take these out. But if you can see, that started pulling on it. It started working. Didn't have it quite seated into the rubber enough. We'll see if I can get this started again. There, I didn't have it seated enough. I think this will do the trick now. If you can get one of these pullers to work, and you can see that did start pulling it off fairly well. Maybe not completely. Let's see if this other size puller might work a little better. Yeah, that's too small. Might take a couple tries. For this particular model of saw, they didn't have a dedicated bearing puller or oil seal puller like some of the other saws. And so that results in a little more effort, or you have to be a little more cautious depending on the method you use, so that you don't cause any damage to the crankcase. All I'm doing here is trying to get this into the seals a little bit firmer so that I can just pull it out, and I think I got it now. Like I said, once you get a tool like this seated, it should work. There, you see it pulling out, and given that the top end isn't in this thicker, I have to hold the rod. Let's see, she just pops it right out like that. And let's take a quick gander. I think the sealing surfaces will be okay on this saw. Look how dirty that is in there. There's so much crap in there. Some of that could have been sucked in from the oil seal under vacuum, or it could have come in through the actual air intake. I don't think this saw was maintained real well, so probably didn't clean the air filter or have it sealed real easily. So there's the first seal off. We're getting really close to being able to split the crankcase open. What we're going to do next is pop off the, listen to that. I think that's all the bearings, but I'll have to get a scope down there, or we'll just look at this after we have it split apart. But with all the gunk that got in this, the bottom end of the crank right here, you can see with all the buildup, and it was scratching on the bottom of the case. That did not ruin the case at all. It doesn't look like the case gasket leaked. But boy, whoever ran this saw just did a terrible job. Didn't do what they should have. They could have gotten much more life out of the bottom end of this saw if they had. But for all we know, this saw still ran for 20 years. These things were pretty robust in the day. Usually the issues you had were associated with oil seals and leaks around the oil pump. All right. All right, we're back. I'm gonna start working on removing the oiler here. That's too big. Yeah, these will be smaller, 3mm. Now, these oilers were actually pretty good and very reliable. I've never had any issues with them, you know, wearing out the gear in here. The bigger issue is this needs to be opened up from time to time, just like taking off the flywheel. And if you do that, you won't have as many issues, especially with flywheel being hard to take off. But these oilers were notorious for, you know, not being able to, you know, this doesn't seal, so crap gets in behind it. It does seal up against the oil seal, which is actually pressed into the housing. You'll see that later. But whether or not, if this seal is good and sound, this was probably cleaned out with a pressure washer, so we can't really tell the state it was in. It doesn't look like it rolled over, so it was installed correctly. But all the oil from the oiler and sawdust and everything, if this doesn't get cleaned after every use using compressed air to keep things nice and clean, over time a lot of gunk gets in behind there and up in behind the oiler, and it's just an absolute mess. And if that seal ever fails and you get some vacuum in there, then a lot of the gunk, especially on the internal O-ring that I'll show you, could actually get in the crank seal or the crank bearing and then cause problems. So don't know if this particular oiler had failed from the last time it was opened up, but periodically cracking open your saws to give them a little bit of love, and particularly replacing the crank bearings from time to time, and then the O-rings on the inside of this oiler pump housing is a good idea, and it doesn't cost much, and it doesn't take really much more than a little bit of your time. There's some other things about these oilers you need to be aware of, especially depending upon the generation, the year of the saw, because they did update these oilers a little bit that you need to be aware of. We will cover that later on in the build when we reinstall this. So now that you've got those 3 bolts open, they were nice enough to design this with these little slots. And what you're going to do there is just put some pressure with a fairly stout straight edge, and they should pop right out. If they don't, then usually it's not because the saw blew up or anything. It's usually because somebody actually used sealant. And I don't want to get in any online argument about whether or not you should use sealant on these. I know some saw builders like Tin Man, who's far more experienced than I am, who swears always had these things fail and needed to use sealant. I haven't needed to do that, but you can see what I mean when I say how dirty they can get in behind here. And I can tell, well, can't really tell if this is coming from elsewhere in the saw or whether there was a vacuum leak coming from around here. But one thing that these O-rings right here need to be replaced frequently enough, and this one was probably passing This is not as bad as I've seen. In fact, my own personal saw was far worse once upon a time. But yeah, there's no question. Even if I didn't sense there was a problem with the crank bearings, we're going to be replacing these. We won't be able to reuse them when we build it to a 288. There's just too many issues there. And it seems like I can't see anything that jumps out at me, but it seems like it is the flywheel side bearing that has some issues. It doesn't seem like, I mean, these are nice and smooth. They're not making noise. It's just the far one here. Once we get this split open and get the bearings off the crank, we're going to know whether it was a bearing or a crankshaft problem. So anyway, there you go. We got the oiler off. I'll probably go into the oiler a little bit more. I can't tell by looking at this, but the diameter here on the oiler is the thing that major thing that changed when they updated that part. And that at the same time then required some different parts that go on to the crankshaft. Instead of a V-ring washer and a dust protector, there were 2 or 3 different parts that they consolidated out and into one washer and a worm gear. I can't tell if this is the updated part offhand or not. It does look like the oiler, it moves freely, and it really isn't worn. I actually think that we'll just clean that up. I think that's going to be just fine. So the only thing that we will replace on this oiler will be this X-ring gasket right here. Obviously the crank seal, and there's a little oil seal on that, and possibly on this screw here, which is what sets your amount of oiling. Otherwise, these were very, very good oilers. And generally speaking, you can reuse these housings and just have to replace a few parts here and there when you're doing some periodic servicing. Okay, we're going to get some stuff cleaned up here, and then we're going to look at splitting the case. All right. See if we can get you a little bit better close-up look. There's the oiler side. Notice I put these oiler bolts back in. When I take apart a saw like this, there's so many parts. If possible, it's a good idea, unless you put them in containers and mark them, just put them back in the holes. That way you don't lose them and you don't get gunk in there if you're not going to be completely taking the saw off. Here's the flywheel side again. Just really, really dirty crank bearings. So I just look in here. Yeah, that's pretty bad. There's just so much junk in there. I don't know if you can see the crank bearings on this side. Just look at all the deposits. There was so much junk and probably bad oil or too much oil combined with fines getting in that saw. All right, so let's take a deeper dive into the crankcase. I think you could tell the saw had some issues. It had blown up. Was the problem an inside out or an outside in problem? Could be both. You saw the outside of the crank bearings, clearly a lot of gunk, but it's just as bad on the inside here. And as you can tell, it's all over the inside of this side of the crankcase. You could see that it's all over the lower end of the crank. A little bit of superficial scoring on this side of the crankcase. Very likely dirty material fines getting in through the air intake, building up and causing a little bit of scratching, but it wasn't anything major that precludes using the crankcase for a rebuild. I'll go over in a later video cleaning up the actual crankshaft. It took a little bit of a job to get that stuff off. And you can see here that it's both sides. So while there may have been leaks through the crank bearings outside in, it clearly the big issue was how the saw was treated and run, and it's an inside out issue mainly that probably blew up this saw. So yeah, the question at this point was whether the crankshaft could also be used and how easy it would be to clean up things.